Hello and welcome to Positive Parenting. I'm Deanne Conrad, Community Relations Supervisor for the Sioux Falls School District. We thank you for joining us on Positive Parenting, which is a joint venture between the medical, child development, and research professionals of Sanford Health and our education experts from the public schools here in Sioux Falls. We're grateful for this partnership. This month we are talking about teen athletes and concussions. Obviously, it's a topic that we've heard a lot about recently in the news. The NFL is paying close attention to concussions and the lifelong consequences that can come from those heavy, hard-hitting injuries that occur on the football field, but not only on the football field. So our panelists are joining us today to tell us more, provide us more insight and awareness. So I'm going to have each of them introduce themselves before we get started here today. And Dr. Muntz, we'll start with you if we could, please.
My name is Thane Muntz. I'm the Director of Research and Development for the Stanford Sports Science Institute.
Thank you. And Molly?
I'm Molly Saturn. I'm the Health Services Supervisor with the Sioux Falls School District.
And I'm Nate Melcha. I'm the Activities Director at Sioux Falls Washington High School.
So thanks everyone for joining us here today for this conversation. I think there has been greater awareness in the community among parents and among medical professionals as well, talking about concussions. Some of that information comes to us because of injury that occurs, and some is just preventative. And so I think creating a greater awareness is important for people to know what to watch out for, what to look for. So first of all, we'll start with the very basics. What happens in the brain when a concussion occurs? I mean, we know that a concussion is something that's because of an impact of some particular kind. Does it have to be a severe impact for the concussion, or is it the type of, the direction of the hit or whatever? So can you give us a little background on that, I guess, if you will?
Sure. First of all, concussions are a very complex injury, and they're caused by a direct or indirect blow to the head that causes the brain to move abruptly and forcefully within the skull. So there's some contact of the brain with inside the skull, but also within the brain, the nerve cells that compose the brain are also stretched and twisted, and that's where a lot of the injury that takes place occurs. And it doesn't have to be the most forceful hit that a player experiences that causes a concussion. That's one of the newest things that we've learned through our research and other people's research, is that there isn't a concussion threshold, force above which if you get hit, you're going to get a concussion, but if you get hit below that threshold, you're going to be fine. It can be a rather mild impact that can cause a concussion, and we don't know how getting hit in different areas of the head or even the whiplash effect. So that's where that indirect blow can come into play. If you get hit in your body and your neck snaps back, you can also suffer that concussive blow. So it's very complex, both in terms of the force of impact and the direction and how that may play into the initial injury and long-term outcomes.
Now, I think a lot of the times we think of football because of the contact that there is as the sport that produces concussions. But there are many other sports like soccer, hockey. My son wrestles, and I know that there's even been, students who have concussions from wrestling or soccer, just a variety of different sports. So football is probably the more common?
Yeah, in terms of rate of occurrence, concussions do happen more commonly in football compared to other sports. And then you start to see sports like hockey and soccer, lacrosse, other contact collision types of sports where the concussion rates are high. But in virtually any sport where there's any possibility of physical contact, you have a risk of concussion. And we have seen wrestlers, we have seen cheer and dance, gymnasts, people who are succumbing to either contact with other players or perhaps may fall and make contact with the floor. And in fact, some of the more severe concussions that we've seen in our concussion clinic have come from athletes, basketball players who have been knocked to the ground and hit their head on the floor, or gymnasts or cheerleaders who have fallen and have hit their head on the ground. So it's often looked at as a football-related injury, but it's really a sports-wide injury that can occur.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that'd be a good time to bring in Nate Melcha, our athletic or activities director, not just athletics, but activities director at Washington High School. What are you seeing in terms of the number of students or I guess the awareness, are there more students who are paying closer attention, the staff paying closer attention, coaching ranks paying closer attention?
Absolutely, and the awareness is out there, not only within our schools, within our coaches, our athletes, but it's a society issue right now too, where it is a hot button topic. So it is getting a lot of attention. But some of the things that we're doing in our schools the last couple of years, our coaches each year by state law are required to take a concussion awareness course each year, and that's a course that's designed by the NFHS, which is the National Federation of State High School Activities Associations. So it's an informational course talking about concussions, being able to recognize symptoms, so when these happen during practice or games, that our coaches are aware of that. And all of our coaches, our head coaches, assistant coaches, volunteer coaches, are all required to take this course. And fortunately, in schools of our size too, we're provided athletic trainers, so we do have that source for a student athlete who is injured to be able to see a trainer and being able to evaluate that injury right away. But we do provide that training for our coaches, so they are aware, because there are times maybe where there's not a trainer around. It's very important that our coaches are able to recognize those symptoms.
And those symptoms first on, I mean, talk a little bit about what if a player has a blow to the head of some sort, or seems a little bit out of it. I mean, what kinds of questions, what kinds of things are coaches looking for?
Well, you're looking at any change in behavior, seeing how the injury happened, just evaluating that, seeing if there's an initial headache, just a variety of symptoms. And once those are recognized, the protocol for our coaches is, if there's any doubt, sit them out and get them out of activity immediately so they can be looked at by a professional, so we can make sure that number one, the kid is safe, and we can go from there too.
So in terms of, we're looking at it from the time it happens with coaches and those who are there at the moment, plus the trainers. And yes, thankfully we have excellent relationship and have trainers available to help sort of direct us and guide us in next steps and such. So when that happens, that has to be a real favorable thing to have somebody right there who's had some knowledge. How critical is it that very quickly those symptoms, those signs are noticed?
It is important. There is a risk of a condition known as second impact syndrome. Although it's very rare, it's potentially fatal, and this is a condition that happens more often in children. If a concussion occurs and an individual gets hit again before that initial injury has healed, there's a risk of brain swelling that can be catastrophic. So again, although it is rare, and I don't want to scare anybody by bringing up that topic, it is a real situation. So it's very important that at the initial instance of those signs or the symptoms that the player is experiencing, that a healthcare provider, a medical professional, be able to evaluate that athlete and really determine whether in fact that is a concussion, if it is an injury that needs to be cared for and managed in a more diligent manner, or if that player is ready to return. As was mentioned, it's really important that when there's any doubt that player is removed, and if the player does suffer a concussion, that they're not allowed to return to play on that same day, and that they have to go through a protocol, a process of making sure that they're able to go from rest to very light activity to more vigorous physical activity without experiencing the symptoms before they're cleared for full return to play.
So I know we have some excellent athletes in our school system that live for being on the court, on the field, and those types of things can be challenges where if you're asking a student, how are you feeling? Do you have a headache? I'm just going to guess by human nature, some of those kids are going to say, no, I feel fine. I feel fine. And
it's a very real phenomenon. In fact, there was a study a few years ago with high school football players, and they asked the players retrospectively after the season if they had experienced any symptoms that were described as a concussion. And they also asked them, did you report these symptoms that you experienced to your coach, a teammate, your parent, athletic trainer, and what they found was that about 47% of those athletes who experienced symptoms did not report them to anybody. So that gives us an indication of how often athletes are experiencing symptoms or don't feel quite right that aren't speaking up. However, I think that has improved. Earlier this year, Ben Roethlisberger, the quarterback for the Steelers, self-reported symptoms. And that's something that probably 5-10 years ago wouldn't have happened at the professional football level. But I think the awareness and the education and an understanding of how serious these injuries can be has really permeated through athletics. And not that everyone is on board and is willing to speak up, but I think the situation has improved. And when you see examples of that, when you see a big tough guy like Ben Roethlisberger stepping up and saying, I'm injured, I think I may be hurt, I need to be evaluated, I think that's really good for student athletes to see and say, if he can do it, maybe I can do it as well. And I don't need to be ashamed or embarrassed to admit that I may be injured.
And he has a little bit more at stake financially on the field than a high school athlete may. But when those injuries occur, they can be not just pertinent to what happens athletically, but those injuries can really lead to challenges in a classroom setting or focusing and that type of thing. What do you or how do you work with athletes who have had an injury of that nature to make sure that their lives as students are adjusted and changed a bit so that they can be healing and take time for that healing process?
Well, we have a school nurse in each of the middle and high schools that would work with the family, would work with the physician, and kind of go through. Typically, the physician will write orders as far as what the student is able to do and what type of accommodations they would recommend. And then the nurse would really put together a plan of care for that student and then relay that care or those accommodations to the staff in the building. And so a student might not need a quiet, dark place to rest. They might need extended time on some of their assignments or tests and quizzes. Just a variety of different accommodations can be made during that initial period when the student is healing. And it's just really working together as a team with the parent and the physician to make sure that we're allowing that student the time to rest and heal.
How critical is that healing process, or what needs to be done during that healing process, and how long does it take? Maybe that's not a fair question because maybe it's different for everybody, but how important is that time for, obviously off the field or off the court, but then also making adjustments in, the student's rest of the day?
The current understanding is that it's very important that concussed athletes and concussed individuals in general be given the opportunity to rest. And this includes not just physical rest, but cognitive rest. So a break from homework and video games and all of the technology.
Video games? What?
And that's one of the biggest challenges today is to get students to put down their phone or to put away their computer and not have that constant stimulation of the brain. Because if you think about it, the brain is the organ that's being injured, and you want to give it rest. Just like if you sprained your ankle, you'd want to give it rest so that you don't potentially re-injure it or cause the injury to get worse. And with a concussion, you want to give the brain a chance to rest. And it used to be thought that, okay, if you just take some time off from physical activity, that was enough. More recently, we've learned that it's that cognitive rest that's really important as well. You make the point, how long, what's the appropriate time? And it is variable. It's been said that a concussion is like a snowflake, no two are alike. And that's very true, both in terms of the mechanism of what causes the injury, but also in terms of the recovery of that injury. So for some individuals, and many individuals do recover rather rapidly within 7 to 10 days, and we know that for the majority of concussed athletes that's the case. But others, their symptoms will persist for weeks to months, and you can't predict that based on the initial injury. So someone may present with a very severe concussion initially, but recover very rapidly, and another person's symptoms may slowly get worse over time, over the first week or two, and they may have symptoms that last for several months. So that's why it's very important that they do get that rest initially and give their brain a chance to recover so that you're not making the symptoms worse.
Well, I would think in coaching, since all of our coaches have gone through this awareness test, we're going to want athletes to take the time, get that rest, How do you know when an athlete is ready to come back?
Well, one thing we do with all of our athletes at Washington High School in the district is that we take an impact test, which is an impact or a baseline test prior to the season. So a test on the computer where they're testing some of those cognitive abilities, and if there is a concussion suspected, those student athletes can come back and take that impact test again to determine maybe the effect of that injury to the student athlete. So that's one way of seeing if a student is ready to go. But I think the big thing too is just recognizing the symptoms, making sure that those students are asymptomatic. And there's a protocol that we use as well with our trainers in conjunction with healthcare professionals, doctors, to get these kids back. But as Dr. Muntz had said too, these injuries vary by the student, and it may take a little time, but just making sure that all of those things are ready to go. The safety of our student athletes is our primary concern, just making sure everything is ready to go before they return to the field of play.
Absolutely, and with the injuries and some of the national stories that have been done on the NFL and some of the long-term effects, I think as a parent, I'm paying close attention to that. And it is important to work, coaches, parents, school nurses, medical professionals, everybody being on the same page. And that has to be a critical component of the healing process. So everybody gets out on the same page, and it's for the betterment of the student, for sure. In terms of South Dakota High School Activities Association, do they have guidelines and things like that that are requirements for concussions, or do we specifically as a district just have our own?
No, these are our guidelines that are through the South Dakota High School Activities Association.
So something that every school district in South Dakota should be paying attention to.
Correct. Yep.
Good, so everybody should be on the same page there. How much are your experiences relied upon for those conversations with South Dakota High School Activities Association or other national organizations?
Yeah, there actually is state legislation, and South Dakota is one of the states. In fact, all 50 states have youth concussion laws now on the books, and that's been something that occurred just over the last 5 years. Mm-hmm. And Stanford Health played a big role in advocating for those laws to be passed in South Dakota, North Dakota, and Minnesota. And it's really that legislation that gives the Activities Association some legs to stand on when enforcing these protocols. So we've played a role as an advocate, and also through our own research, we've added to the conversation and tried to provide information that I think people are hungry for. They're hungry for knowledge and information about not only the short-term risk, but really that long-term risk. What are the long-term consequences of brain injury and concussion for high school and even younger student athletes? What are they going to experience down the road? So we're trying from all fronts, really, from research, from clinical care, from advocacy, to try and really have a seat at the table and play a role in making sports safer for athletes.
Mm-hmm. And I think that leads us well into the prevention side of things. I know there are different types of equipment that are being developed for prevention or better prevention. Is that a false sense of security for us, or are things really, medically and manufacturing wise, are we doing a good enough job with some of the equipment that's out there?
There's certainly room for improvement with the equipment. One thing that's important for people to understand is that just the anatomy of the brain and the physics of impacts that take place in sports, you're never going to be able to completely eliminate the risk of concussions in sports like football, hockey, even soccer and basketball. So we can probably close that gap a little bit with technology, in particular in sports that wear helmets. Helmet technology has come a long way in the last 30 to 40 years, but the modern football helmet was designed to protect the skull, not to protect the brain. So manufacturers now are kind of spinning their wheels and trying to get up to speed with trying to create designs that in fact can mitigate those forces that are going to have a positive effect on protecting the brain. But there are some limits in what you can do with an external helmet. So people shouldn't get up their hopes thinking that there's going to be a technological solution to prevent concussions, although, again, I think we'll see improvements in the next few years, which hopefully will lower those risks without completely eliminating them.
I'm just thinking of the 1905 pictures from Washington High School of the football players wearing the thin little leather helmet. That doesn't seem like, the pictures are interesting and cool to look at, but there wasn't a whole lot of protection there, I don't think, back in those days. And pads weren't what they are today either, so it's interesting. Now,
If I may, it's
Sure.
important to recognize that back in that era, there were dozens or at least 15 to 20 deaths per year in football on the football field due to head injuries, and those numbers have drastically gone down. So, with football, the injury is cyclical. We always come back to how dangerous is the sport, and these are questions that they faced 100 years ago, and it was responded to by changing some rules of the game, developing better equipment, some of the same challenges and things that we're facing again. So you can look back in history and see how the game and the sport has evolved, and hopefully we'll be able to make another step, another positive evolution in the game to help make it safer.
right, it is important to note that yes, there were injuries back then, and we've come a long way since that time, and that prevention and those steps that we're taking are key to making that happen. In terms of the school district, what should a parent do if they feel like, okay, they took the impact test, everything came back okay, but something just doesn't seem right? You're a mom, Molly.
Yeah. I would say any parent who has questions should seek out the advice of their medical provider. I know the impact testing is shared with the physicians, and they can use that in their assessment of the student. And so it's just very important for them to reach out for that medical advice, and then bringing that information back to us at the school again, so that we can know how to best serve that student. Is very important. So.
And when students are in the classroom, even if maybe they haven't been identified early on and they come down to the nurse's office or something, or say, I've been, I think I might have had my bell rung. Or
Yes, that
something
absolutely
along
happens. That possibly it wasn't initially identified, and it's a day or two later, and they're just saying, wow, something's not right, and they usually do seek out the school nurse in those situations, and then there's usually a call to the parent and advising them to seek medical attention for that. And so, yep, that definitely happens that way. And there are other concussions that occur outside of athletics that get brought to our attention as well, and so we would treat that the same way.
Yeah, and in a school the size of 2,000 students, I have to believe there's probably a handful of students every day that are dealing with some sort of issue.
Yeah, and as Molly talks about too, I mean, working with students in the classroom with those accommodations based on what their protocol is and how they're doing. But we're dealing with several situations on that per season. Just working with the kids not only in the classroom, but working with them on the athletic fields as well. Just progressing. These kids are working to get back, but we're very very careful about getting them back before it's. I mean, obviously you're not getting them back too early, but you're working with a number of people. It's a collaborative effort, not only with the school nurse and the school setting, but also with the coaches, with the athletic trainers, with the parents. There's a lot of communication involved when we're getting a kid back to the field of play.
Right. Well, I think that's a great team effort that has to be if we're going to prevent these types of things, or at least help in the healing process. That's critical that everybody's on the same page then.
That's right. Yeah, there are a lot of stakeholders involved, and it starts with the athlete, and everyone should be first and foremost concerned about the athlete's care and proper recovery. But you have to realize that the athlete is injured, and in this particular case, when we're talking about a concussion, the decision-making organ of the body is injured, and sometimes you're asking that person to report their symptoms or to tell you how they feel, and they may not be able to do that accurately or properly because of their injury. So that's why it is very important for the parents to be vigilant and keep an eye on what's going on with the athlete, and teachers and coaches that are going to see that student in school, that are going to see things that maybe the parents wouldn't recognize. And that communication is key with sharing that information among that team and the healthcare providers, so that student can be cared for properly.
Right. We're coming up on our end of time. So
Yep, and I'll second that too, just educating the parents, and that's a part of our consent form that we have prior to our student athletes or students participating in activities. That there is a section on concussions and symptoms and just general information on that parents do sign off on. So to second that from Dr. Muntz, it is educating the parents as well.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, like I said, we're coming up on the end of our time. Any final thoughts, Molly?
No, I would agree with that as well. There are times when it's appropriate for a student to have complete rest, and so that can be a very, very hard thing for parents and students to accept, that maybe they are not in school, maybe they're at home on complete rest, they're not working on homework, and that can be a stressful time for a student. And so it's just really important to have those conversations and make sure that parents are aware of that and the importance of following those doctor's orders. And so, it's a team effort to make sure everyone's educated and knowledgeable on the subject. So.
Sure. Lots to know and learn. Any final thoughts from you, Dr. Muntz?
Sure. I just want people to know that concussions aren't anything new. They're not new injuries, but we're just becoming more educated and aware about them, and that's a good thing. The more aware we are, and you may hear that concussion rates are higher, and a lot of that is due to people just being more aware and be able to recognize and diagnose those injuries. So we're making a lot of progress, and I think that we should be optimistic about where we're going with being able to recognize, treat, and manage these injuries.
Okay. Well, very important topic, and impacts, whether we know it or not, it impacts a lot of lives out there, student athletes' lives, the parents' lives, the friends of those who are around them and such. So certainly something to pay close attention to and give proper attention to as you're working with a student athlete or parenting one as well. So thanks for joining us today on Positive Parenting.